Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Today we're going to start discussing the tradition that moderns call Buddhism. That tradition grew out of the same religious questions of ancient North Indian religion that begot the Vedas, especially the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita. So be sure you understand these questions that we asked before. According to Krishna, how can we detect transcendent reality in mundane things? What kinds of things? What is Krishna's darshana to Arjuna? What does Arjuna see? What do you think the Sanjaya means when he says, "Wherever is Krishna, Yoga's Lord, wherever is Arjuna, there are splendor, victory, wealth, and right order"? Part 1. Another solution to Samsara. When we looked at the Bhagavad Gita, we noticed that it was arising out of a problem. How are we to escape ignorance and the suffering it causes? For the author of the Bhagavad Gita, and for most Hindus today, we are reborn over and over again because we are constantly accumulating karma. That karma is bound to us, to our true selves, our Atman, and therefore reappears lifetime after lifetime. Everyone, everything, everywhere is ensnared by karma. Sometimes karma is good, and therefore one benefits by being born into, say, for instance, a higher position in our future lives. A low-caste human might be born into a higher caste. Or, if a human is particularly virtuous, she might even be born as a deva, a god, and enjoy an enormously long life with all the pleasures being a god entails. However, even gods can fall. Eventually, everything, including gods, will accumulate negative karma too, bringing them back down to even the lowest of births. And so, all is stuck in the everlasting cycle of samsara, the wandering of the self from life to life. So how to get out? The ancient peoples of the northern subcontinent proposed many options. We saw one already in the Bhagavad Gita. There, Krishna, avatar of Vishnu, told his friend Arjuna that all he has to do is follow his dharma, the order of things. So, in the case of Arjuna, he was a ruler or a warrior, that is, a kshatriya. He shouldn't run off into the wilderness and live as a sadhu. That would be merely a vain attempt to run away from his own dharma. No, he must fight and rule, because that is the dharma of his caste. However, Arjuna must also perform this dharma, not for its own sake. He must not act because he wants to claim the fruits of his karma. That would be greed or selfishness. No, he has to act out of bhakti, devotion to Krishna. Everything Arjuna does, including fighting and killing, has to be done as a kind of sacrifice to ultimate reality, to Brahman, to Vishnu. By still acting, but making no claims to the effects of his actions, Arjuna can avoid accumulating more karma. And therefore, he can win moksha, liberation from rebirth, the way out of inevitable pain, loss, and ensnarement, which is the very nature of samsara. Krishna's yoga was not the only proposed way to escape samsara. There was, for just one example, another member of the ruling warrior caste, the kshatriya, who also struggled over this problem. This man would later be known as the Buddha, the awakened one. But, unlike the account of Krishna, the Buddha's teachings would minimize, ignore, or actively reject the ritualism of the Vedas. So, who was this Buddha? There are many stories about him. some liturgical, some philosophical, and some outright miraculous. And at the end of the day, we have to ask about the historical accuracy of them all. We've already met important historical figures whose biographies are quite problematic. This isn't just an issue, of course, for religious leaders. Ancient history in general is very dodgy and difficult to reconstruct. But in the case of the Buddha, the problem is especially glaring. First, because the Buddha's own life is particularly important to Buddhists today. His teachings and activities are authoritative. Who he was and what he said isn't just important, it's true. So asking hard questions about what he said or didn't say or did or didn't do isn't just a historian's problem. It's making claims about what a living Buddhist is actually supposed to believe or do. Second, finding this historical Buddha is especially pressing because the scale of Buddhism is so wide. Today, Buddhism is the religion of some 400 million people. He isn't just some obscure historical figure. Third, the gap in time between when the Buddha would have actually lived and when the records about him appeared is especially wide. Biographical materials about the Buddha didn't start to appear until many centuries after his death. The accounts of his life that we do have now are removed from the man himself by at least 400 years. That would be like if the first written reference to Shakespeare only appeared yesterday. So even the earliest records of the Buddha's life aren't even that close to this man that we're talking about. Part 2. Gautama Siddhartha. Putting aside questions of historical accuracy, the biographical accounts of the Buddha do have some elements in common. This man called the Buddha, the enlightened or awakened one, was born Gautama Siddhartha. Gautama was his family name, Siddhartha his given name. Siddhartha, we're told, came from the town of Lumbini in modern Nepal. He spoke the language called Pali, a language closely related to Sanskrit. We aren't exactly sure when he was born. Records point anywhere between 563 and 785 BCE. So that's a 78-year period in which he might have been born. And similarly, his death was somewhere between the years 483 and 400 BCE. Like I said, precise details about him are rather dodgy, so the best we can say is that he lived during the 5th century BCE. Whenever he was born, we are told that he was a kshatriya, the ruler warrior varna of the caste system. So he wasn't born to be a holy man, he was born to rule and fight, like Arjuna was too. The stories tell us that around the time of his birth, a seer, a man with supernatural foresight, predicted that this boy, Siddhartha, would either be a great ruler or a great religious teacher. Siddhartha's father, himself a ruler and warrior, kshatriya, naturally wanted his son to be a political leader, not a religious one. He wanted his son to follow the dharma of their caste, their varna. And so Siddhartha was raised surrounded only by wealth and luxury, wine and women and song, all that sort of thing. He married a young woman, they had a son, and Siddhartha probably lived his life without a care in the world. Then, sometime around the age of 29, Siddhartha had 4 encounters which shook up the ease of his life. These encounters were later called the 4 sights. First, he caught sight of an old man. Remember that he lives a life of opulence, and he's probably surrounded only by young, beautiful people all the time. He probably never met someone older than his own father. But here was a very old man, whose body was breaking down. Then, another time, Siddhartha saw a person riddled with illness. Again, hidden in some palace or pleasure garden, a young wealthy man may never have actually seen someone dying of plague or the pox. Yet another time, Siddhartha saw a dead body. Remember that for most cultures at most times, it was up to a person's family to dispose of their loved one's remains. But if you had no family or died alone, or died far from home, your body would just remain exposed, rotting and getting eaten by animals. Now, Siddhartha never had to see what an exposed body was like. Remember, he was a relatively wealthy, comfortable man. So, like most of us today, seeing a dead body just lying around must have shocked him. Now, we need to project a little bit onto this story. We can imagine a young, rich man who doesn't really have anything to worry about in life, and he's probably a little bit naive about how the world works. He's never had to work, or really worry. He's never had to deal with elderly people, severe illness, or bodies. And so we can guess that such experiences must have struck him with particular force. But then we're told, Siddhartha witnessed a fourth thing. He saw a renouncer, a wanderer, an early sadhu. Someone who volunteered to live a simple life in the forest, mostly alone. Someone without proper clothes or food, who didn't bathe regularly. And Siddhartha learned that this man was looking for a way to escape the problems of illness, old age, and dying. He was trying to find liberation from the endless horrors of birth, death, and rebirth. In Pali, Siddhartha's own language, this liberation would have been called nibbana, from the Sanskrit nirvana, an extinguishing or extinction of samsara. By the way, the word nirvana is just another word for moksha. They're relatively interchangeable, although generally moksha refers to Hinduism and nirvana refers to Buddhism, but in truth either can refer to either tradition. Siddhartha therefore decided to escape all the pains of life that he had recently learned about. So, first, he had to renounce all his ties to the world. He removed his earplugs, cut his hair, and took the clothes of a beggar. And then, in secret, he left his family, including his own wife and infant son. He then set out to live in the wilderness under the tutelage of a number of yogis and gurus. He would stay with one for a while, learn what they had to teach, and then move on to learn more. Finally, he came to a group of 5 ascetics, people who practice severe self-discipline and deny themselves all pleasure. They thought that if they could free themselves from attachment to desires, they could break the cycle of samsara. They tortured their bodies by sitting in deliberately painful positions. They would hold their breaths for long periods of time and deny themselves sleep. They would eat only waste, like bird droppings, and even then only enough to keep themselves alive. They deliberately lived on the brink of starvation and exposure in hopes of ridding themselves of attachments. Siddhartha lived like this for about 6 years, we're told, until he finally snapped. It wasn't working. He hadn't reached nirvana. Living a life of pure luxury didn't work. Living a life of no luxury didn't work. So, how was he supposed to move along? Siddhartha argued that he should follow the middle way, a path between radical self-destruction on one side and radical indulgence on the other. Around the age of 35 and healthy again, Siddhartha was sitting under a tree near the village of Gaya, the modern town of Bodh Gaya. And there, we're told, he achieved nirvana. That is, he woke up, bodh, to the truth and became an awakened or awakened one, a Buddha. He figured something out. He became enlightened, and thus the chain of samsara was broken. He had learned how things really were. He figured out something transcendent about the universe, something that's true all the time, regardless of what we say about it or think about it. And because it is transcendent, it couldn't be spoken of directly. And so Siddhartha, now a Buddha, wondered if he could teach what he had learned to others. And so he continued to sit there until eventually he resolved to try. He was going to try and explain what he had learned to other people. First, he returned to his old gang of ascetics. He told them what he had learned and how he had attained nirvana, and they listened. And they became his first disciples, the first people that we can call Buddhists. And then the Buddha could return to his homeland, where many of his family members became his followers too. This included his son, his father, his aunt, and his cousin. This new community of the Buddha's followers was to be called the Sangha, the assembly, the community. Members of the Sangha tried their best to follow the Buddha's teachings and took oaths to give up many of life's pleasures in pursuit of enlightenment, nirvana. In function, they would become the first nuns and monks. They would wander the land, living by begging alone. During the rainy season, when travel became difficult, they would retire to safe places like the residence of a wealthy supporter of the Sangha. And so, as far as we can tell, this kind of reciprocal relationship became the norm. The Sangha lived lives of simplicity and meditation as clergy, while people who wouldn't or couldn't join up with them became a laity. This laity would offer the Sangha shelter, food, and, when necessary, other things they might need to continue their ministries. The Buddha and his Sangha continued on like this for 45 years, until the Buddha was 80 years old. Then, because of either natural sickness, old age, or perhaps a questionable meal, the sources are a little dodgy on this one too, the Buddha became ill. But we are told he preached, even unto his death. Now, there are other versions of the Buddha's story that have different details, and they all tend to have more miraculous elements. They'll include details about how the gods, the devas, would variously prompt Siddhartha along his quests so that someday they could learn his teachings. Even gods want to reach nirvana. Or we can read about how Siddhartha, the would-be Buddha, sat under the Bodhi tree, the tree of illumination, and engaged in a kind of psychic combat with Mara, the personification of death and illusion. And we could hear stories about how the Buddha walked on the sky, or had telepathic abilities, or how he knew about his own past lives. But roughly, all the stories of the Buddha follow the similar format. He is wealthy, renounces the world, becomes an ascetic, finds a more moderate middle way, wins nirvana, establishes a Sangha, and passes away as an old man. Part 3. The Buddhadharma. What did the Buddha awaken to? What did he figure out that won him nirvana? What turned Siddhartha into the Buddha? The Buddha's teachings, or the Buddhadharma, are interlocked with the accounts of his life. If the stories about the Buddha are accurate, the Buddhadharma is a reflection of the episodes of his biography. Or, if the stories about the Buddha are just folk tales, then they were created specifically to express the Buddhadharma in narrative forms. It begins with the four sights, Siddhartha's encounter with old age, sickness, death, and renunciation. Each of these things is a symbol of the impermanence of everything. They're antiya. Antiya, in Sanskrit, or anicca in Pali, is the understanding that everything that exists is going to perish. By the way, this is already an ancient thought by this point. The Vedas discuss it, as does the Bhagavad Gita, which is roughly contemporaneous with early Buddhism. They all agree that the very nature of every existing thing is that it's temporary. Everything is subject to aging, breaking down, and destruction. But where the Buddhadharma differs from the Hindu scriptures is over the issue of the Atman, the eternal, undying self. In the Bhagavad Gita, we saw Krishna tell his followers something everlasting dwells inside of them, And this self, the Atman, was divine. It was the presence of Brahman. The early Buddhists seem to have rejected this. Not only was there antiya, impermanence, that impermanence applied to absolutely everything, even the self. Indeed, there was no self, really. It wasn't Atman, it was anatman, no self. The very notion that there's something inside of us that defies death, something that's permanent, is just another illusion. In fact, the false idea that we have anything that we might call a self is actually a hurdle to nirvana. It tricks us into thinking that we have access to something real and everlasting. But there is nothing that's innately you. Even you are impermanent. This central doctrine of the Buddhists is shunyata, emptiness. Everything, everywhere, is always empty, without a self or even a lasting reality. While people, the world, and the gods all exist, it's only for a passing moment. There's nothing lasting in any of them. In the end, everything is ultimately empty and formless. And this is how Siddhartha's career began. He realized that everything he thought he knew and loved was actually empty, shunyata, because nothing has an ultimate self, an Atman, and everything is impermanent, antiya. Often, the Buddha is depicted as something like a doctor. A doctor is someone who not only cures the sick, but first diagnoses the sickness. You have to understand what the problem is before you can solve it, right? Well, the Buddha's diagnosis and prescription, as it were, of the human situation form the heart of the Buddhadharma. They are usually expressed as a list called the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is suffering. There's something out of sorts with the human condition, something disjointed. We call it suffering. While we might be able to escape suffering for some time, it's always coming for us. You can live free from suffering today, but because of antiya, the temporary nature of everything that exists, we're bound to lose whatever makes us happy sooner or later. You can be made happy by food or drinking or sex or money, but those things can't last. You may love someone, but they're destined to die. And even you, the very last place to hide inside yourself, well, you're not going to be around forever either, because an Atman, even yourself, is temporary. It only exists for a moment. The second noble truth, though, is that this suffering has a cause. While suffering plagues all the beings in the universe, it comes from somewhere. It isn't just our nature to suffer. Something is making us suffer. And that takes us to the third noble truth. If there's a cause, there's a treatment. A cause can be removed. There is something we can do to escape suffering itself. There is a cure to the disease of suffering. And the contents of that treatment, the medicine, is the fourth noble truth, called the path. The practices that the Buddha suggests, they're things we have to do to escape the cycle of samsara, which can only lead to ever more suffering. And so, what do we need to do? We have to favor the middle way. Things which are neither purely luxurious, for that would just make us more attached to impermanent things, making their loss even worse. But neither should we be radically ascetic. That is, that would just be causing suffering on ourselves directly. And so, the Buddhadharma says there are 8 specific things we have to do to liberate ourselves from suffering. We have to have, first, the right view, meaning the right opinions. We need to understand that suffering and death is real, that we're stuck in a terrible cycle of pain that stretches out across lifetimes, and that we need to get out of it. We need to have the right resolve. We have to be willing to do whatever it takes to break away from our pain, by turning away from our ties to family, comfort, and even the world itself. In other words, we have to be willing to take up the life of the Sangha as a monk or a nun. We have to have the right speech. You can never be mean, or crude, or lie, because the way to nirvana depends on us being truthful, honest, and compassionate, both to ourselves and to others. Fourth, we need to have the right actions. That means we can't perform actions which cause us to suffer or cause other beings to suffer. So, no killing, no stealing, no sex. This almost always includes giving up on meat too, as killing an animal is causing that being to suffer. Fifth, we have to have the right livelihood. You can't escape suffering if it's built into your daily job. So, working for money or comfort is always just going to lead to more suffering. So, instead, you have to possess only what you need to survive, and live a life as a beggar, asking for what you need and nothing more. Sixth, we have to have the right effort. Just as your actions should not lead to suffering for yourself or others, so should your thoughts. So we need to avoid thinking about things like sex, violence, or wealth, because these just attach us to the world and therefore lead us right back to suffering. Seventh, we need to have the right mindfulness. You can't stumble your way out of suffering and pain. You have to consider what it is that you do. You have to think and act deliberately. You have to constantly look at yourself and the world and ask, does this cause suffering? Is it permanent? Is it good? And eighth, the right concentration. All these previous 7 items require that you understand the world around you and express discipline. Well, how can discipline be learned? The Buddhadharma concludes its Eightfold Path by calling you to meditate. Your mind and your body need training, honing. You aren't just born being mindful, moral, and compassionate. You have to learn these things. And meditation, the controlling of your mind and body, can help you learn that. Together, the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path are the kernel of the Buddhadharma, and the shared opinions of the Sangha. Together, they try to find that middle way that was exemplified by the Buddha's life. Don't torture yourself, but don't pamper yourself either. Just be mindful. Look for the causes of pain and suffering, and do what you can to reduce it in yourself and others. When you come to class, be ready to answer these questions in detail. Who is Gautama Siddhartha? What are some important episodes in his life? What is the meaning of nirvana, Bhuta, Sangha, Shunyata, Anatman, and Antiya? What are the 4 Noble Truths? What is the Eightfold Path?